Welcome to Declassified. I'm Nathaniel Shepard, your host on behalf of author Daniel P. Douglas. In this series, we reveal real Cold War secrets and excavate the classified details your government hoped you'd never discover. And here we go. Operation Washtub, when America armed bush pilots with silenced pistols and gold coins to fight the Soviets. It was January 1951. The Korean War was 6 months old and going badly. American soldiers were dying in frozen mountain passes, while Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River. In Washington, military planners stared at maps and saw something terrifying. Alaska was only a few miles from Soviet territory. If the Soviets invaded, there was almost nothing to stop them. Alaska wasn't even a state yet. It was a territory, vast and frozen, and barely defended. The military believed the attack would come from the air, with Soviet bombers followed by paratroopers dropping into Anchorage, Fairbanks, Nome, and Seward. Once the Russians landed, who would fight them in the wilderness? The answer, according to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and his former protégé Joseph Carroll at the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, was bush pilots, trappers, miners, fishermen, ordinary Alaskans who knew the frozen landscape better than any soldier ever could. This was Operation Washtub, and it was about to become one of the strangest spy programs in American history. The fear of a Soviet invasion of Alaska wasn't just paranoia. It had a logic to it. The kind of logic that only makes sense when you're convinced World War III could start any day. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, years ahead of American predictions. In 1950, Soviet-backed North Korea invaded South Korea, and some Pentagon analysts believed Korea was a feint, a distraction. Moscow's real target, they believed, might be Western Europe, or it might be Alaska, where the Bering Strait separated the two superpowers by less than the length of a decent Sunday drive. Alaska was also a former Russian colony, purchased by the United States in 1867 for $7.2 million. Some planners worried the Soviets might want it back. After all, the Japanese had invaded the Aleutian Islands during World War II, occupying American soil for over a year. If Japan could do it, the Soviet Union certainly could. The problem was defense. Alaska was enormous, remote, and brutally cold. There were more moose than military personnel. If Soviet paratroopers landed in the interior, conventional forces would take days or weeks to respond. By then, the territory could be occupied. So Hoover and Carroll hatched a plan. They would recruit ordinary Alaskans, train them in espionage, arm them with weapons and survival gear, and hide supply caches across the frozen wilderness. If the Soviets invaded, these civilian agents would stay behind while everyone else evacuated. They would hide, observe, and report enemy movements by coded radio transmissions. The Air Force called it Operation Washtub. The FBI called it Stage. Both names were classified. The agents themselves were told never to speak of it. The program would remain secret for more than 50 years. The plan called for a very specific kind of agent. According to the declassified documents, recruits had to be permanent Alaska residents with established livelihoods and logical reasons for being placed where they intend to operate. They could not be current or former military. They could not be government employees. They had to be people who would blend in, who wouldn't be obvious targets for Soviet occupation forces trained to eliminate local resistance. Bush pilots were perfect. They already flew to isolated mining camps, remote villages, and distant fishing operations. Nobody would question a bush pilot being anywhere in Alaska. Their bird's-eye view could document Soviet positions, troop movements, and supply lines. And they had the survival skills to stay alive in conditions that would kill most people in a matter of days. The FBI tapped its local contacts, including federal judges, the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Anchorage, and an Anchorage physician, to identify reliable candidates. The initial pool of potential recruits numbered as high as 40,000 people, according to FBI documents. From that pool, 89 were eventually selected and trained. The character sketches in the declassified files read like casting notes for a Jack London novel. One candidate was described as a professional photographer in Anchorage who had only one arm, and it is felt that he would not benefit the enemy in any labor battalion. The same man was noted as reasonably intelligent, particularly crafty, and possessed of sufficient physical courage, as is indicated by his offer to guide a party which was to have hunted Kodiak bear armed only with bow and arrow. A one-armed bear hunter with a bow and arrow. The FBI wanted to make him a spy. Other named agents included Dighton Ab Gillard, a well-known bush pilot from Cooper Landing on the Kenai Peninsula. Guy Raymond was described as a heavy-set tin miner from Lost River who had tattoos of a dagger and an eagle on his arms. Ira Weisner came from the gold mining town of Rampart. One candidate was the postmaster in Kiana. Another managed a hotel in Valdez. The most notable recruit was Bob Reeve, founder of Reeve Aleutian Airways and one of Alaska's most legendary bush pilots. Reeve had pioneered glacier flying in the 1930s, landing planes on glaciers so steep that other pilots considered it suicide. During World War II, he flew military supplies through the Aleutian Islands, one of the only civilian pilots authorized to operate in combat zones. General Jimmy Doolittle said Reeve proved the airplane offered the key to the future of Alaska. FBI background check documents reference the general manager of Reeve Aleutian Airlines. Only one man ever held that title. Reeve's son later said his father never spoke or left any record of such service. One group, however, was completely excluded. The declassified documents contain some of the most openly racist language you'll find in any government file from this era, and that's saying something. Alaska Native populations, the Eskimo, Indian, and Aleutian communities who had lived on this land for thousands of years were explicitly forbidden from participating in Operation Washtub. The reasoning, laid out in official government memos, was appalling. The selection of agents from the Eskimo, Indian, and Aleutian groups in the territory should be avoided in view of their propensities to drink to excess and their fundamental indifference to constituted governments and political philosophies. It got worse. Another memo stated, the Eskimo would probably not resist an invasion and would readily accept foreign rule if the Eskimo is provided the necessities for sustaining life. The Eskimo just cannot comprehend the feeling of loyalty to the government. One memo reduced it to a single sentence. The use of natives in any phase of the plan is not desirable. This was despite the fact that Alaska natives had served with distinction in the Alaska Territorial Guard during World War II. They knew the land better than any transplanted miner or bush pilot ever could. They had survived in the Arctic for thousands of years without survival caches or government-issued climbing rope. The irony would deepen decades later. After Operation Washtub ended, the military created the Alaska Scouts, a National Guard unit composed largely of the same Alaska Native communities that Washtub had rejected. These scouts became America's actual first line of Cold War defense in the Arctic. The people the government said couldn't comprehend, loyalty ended up guarding the very frontier that Operation Washtub was supposed to protect. Silenced pistols, gold coins, and 15 hours of code training. Recruits were flown to Washington, D.C. or Seattle for training. Each agent was trained separately, kept unaware of the other agents' identities, so that if one was captured, the rest wouldn't be compromised. The training curriculum was ambitious. Agents received instruction in encoding and decoding messages, surreptitious photography, map reading, methods of interrogation and recruitment of informants, scouting and patrolling, close combat, airdrop and pickup techniques, and Arctic survival. They were also trained to recognize Russian uniforms and military equipment so they could identify enemy forces and report accurately. The coding and decoding portion proved to be a challenge. One declassified document described the experience with brutal honesty, calling it an almost impossible task for backwoodsmen to master in 15 hours of training. These were men who could land a plane on a glacier in a blizzard, track a moose through whiteout conditions, and survive a winter in a cabin with no running water. But writing coded messages, that was harder than anything the wilderness had ever thrown at them. Meanwhile, the government scattered survival caches across Alaska's frozen landscape. These were hidden in caves, remote cabins, buried underground, or tucked into distant forests. Each cache cost about $2,500 to prepare and stock in 1951. Roughly $29,000 in today's money. The contents were a spy's winter survival kit. Each cache held a .30 caliber semi-automatic rifle with a telescopic sight, a small caliber pistol fitted with a silencer, 150 feet of climbing rope, commercial skis, snowshoes, a camera, radio equipment, explosives to destroy evidence if necessary, and $500 in gold or silver coins for bartering. There was enough food, fuel, clothing, and medicine to sustain one person for up to a year. Agents received $3,000 annually just to remain on standby, with the promise of doubled pay if the invasion actually happened. The average age of the recruits was 50. These were not young men playing soldier. They were middle-aged Alaskans with families, businesses, and lives who had agreed to stay behind and die if their country needed them to. Women were also excluded from the program. The declassified documents offered no explanation. One sentence simply stated, "Women will not be used in any operation contemplated by the proposed plan." Hoover gets cold feet. The program barely survived its first year. On September 8, 1951, less than 12 months after Operation Washtub began, J. Edgar Hoover pulled the FBI out entirely. He did it without warning, even though his own top lieutenants had advised him just 1 month earlier that the FBI was in these programs neck deep, with an obvious and inescapable responsibility. Hoover didn't care. He saw the political math clearly. If the Soviets actually invaded Alaska and the program failed, the FBI would take the blame. He scribbled his reasoning in the margin of a memo. If a crisis arose, we would be in the midst of another Pearl Harbor and get part of the blame. Then he added one final order: get out at once. The Air Force's Office of Special Investigations was left holding the bag, running the program alone for the next 8 years. The FBI continued to provide background checks on potential agents, but otherwise wanted nothing to do with Washtub. Hoover had calculated that the risk of embarrassment outweighed the risk of Soviet invasion, and he wasn't wrong. The Soviets never came, but neither did any credit for the FBI. From the beginning, the FBI's Anchorage office had been skeptical. They were slow in producing agent candidates. As of September 6, 1951, more than a year after beginning their search, they had identified only 69 potential recruits. The local agents could see what Washington couldn't. Alaska was too big, too wild, and too sparsely populated for 89 civilian spies to make a difference against a full-scale Soviet invasion. The coded message that panicked Washington. 3 years after Hoover pulled the FBI out of Washtub, the operation came back to haunt him. In October 1954, a woman in Anchorage received a strange envelope. Inside was a typewritten letter containing what appeared to be a coded message. The letter had been misaddressed by the anonymous sender in Fairbanks. The woman turned it over to the FBI. Espionage was suspected immediately. Internal memos flew between offices. Hoover was personally informed. Bureau code breakers urgently tried to decipher the mysterious message. For a brief, panicked moment, it looked like the Soviets might actually have agents operating inside Alaska. They never cracked the code, but they eventually figured out what had happened. The mystery message was not from an enemy spy. It was a practice message sent by one of the Operation Washtub agents who had accidentally mailed it to the wrong address. A backwoodsman who could barely master 15 hours of code training had accidentally triggered a national security panic by mailing his homework to the wrong person. If you ever needed proof that Operation Washtub was held together with duct tape and optimism, this was it. The caches that time forgot. Operation Washtub ran from 1951 to 1959. It ended when Alaska achieved statehood, though the real reasons were more practical. Maintaining 89 agents and weatherproofing supply caches against Alaska's extreme temperatures had become unsustainable. The costs kept climbing while the Soviet invasion kept not happening. The program's official historian, Deborah Kidwell, of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, later wrote that the survival caches served peacetime purposes for many years to come. They were converted into emergency supply stations for survivors of aircraft accidents in the remote wilderness. The sniper rifles and silenced pistols were presumably removed. The gold coins are another matter entirely. By 1961, the caches were abandoned completely. A 1988 account published in a military history journal claimed many had been looted by trappers and others. In 1989, the Army Corps of Engineers searched for the remaining caches and came up empty-handed. Somewhere in Alaska's wilderness, there may still be survival caches from Operation Washtub, buried underground or tucked into forgotten caves. The rifles are probably rusted. The food is certainly gone. But the gold and silver coins don't corrode. If you find $500 in 1951 gold coins in an Alaskan cave, you'll know where they came from. As for the connection to broader Cold War stay-behind programs, Operation Washtub was essentially America's domestic version of Operation Gladio, the NATO program that built secret resistance networks across Western Europe in case of Soviet invasion. We covered Gladio in a previous episode, where those European networks were eventually linked to political violence and false flag terrorism. Washtub never reached that level of complexity or controversy, mostly because it never had the chance. The invasion it was designed for never came. The verdict. Operation Washtub ended without a single agent ever activating a hidden cache. No coded messages were sent about enemy movements. No Soviet paratroopers landed in Anchorage. No bush pilot ever had to choose between evacuating with his family or staying behind to spy for his country. The program was classified for more than 50 years. When 704 Air Force documents and nearly 3,000 pages of FBI files were finally declassified in 2014, most of the agents' names were still redacted. The men who volunteered to become America's last line of defense in the Arctic were never publicly recognized. Almost all of them are dead now. Dighton Ab Gillard, the bush pilot from Cooper Landing, died in a plane crash on Montague Island in 1955 at age 45. Bob Reeve never confirmed his involvement, but when his biographer asked whether Alaskans were afraid of the Russians crossing the Bering Strait, Reeve gave an answer that hinted at something more than casual confidence. "Hell no," he said. "If we don't knock 'em down like pigeons before they get across the Alaskan range, we Alaskans, each with a half-dozen guns and ammunition, will just kick their teeth out." He knew something. He just couldn't say what. In the end, Operation Washtub is a story about ordinary people who agreed to do an extraordinary thing, organized by a government that couldn't quite figure out how to let them do it. The FBI built a program and then abandoned it. The Air Force ran it on a shoestring. The agents trained for a war that never came, carried a secret they could never share, and went back to flying planes, mining tin, and guiding bear hunts in the Alaskan wilderness. The government excluded the Alaska natives who knew the land best, armed the bush pilots who knew it second best, and then spent 8 years waiting for an invasion that would never happen. The only intelligence crisis the program ever produced was a practice message mailed to the wrong house. This was Cold War planning at its most human, not evil like MK Ultra, not absurd like Acoustic Kitty, just desperately hopeful. 89 men with silenced pistols and gold coins waiting for a signal that never came. Some of the caches are probably still out there. The agents are almost certainly not. And somewhere in the declassified files, there's a profile of a one-armed photographer who hunted Kodiak bears with a bow and arrow. The government thought he'd make a perfect spy. They were probably right. And there it is, another documented descent into the declassified, filed properly, stamped accordingly, and revealed at last. I'm Nathaniel Shepard, your host on behalf of author Daniel P. Douglas. Be sure to check out Daniel's Substack, The Intelligence Bulletin from author Daniel P. Douglas, for other podcast series, written articles, and links to all of his books. Thank you for listening.